Okay, how do we measure personality? There are a few techniques. One is a technique called a projective technique. What you're seeing in that picture is what is called a Rorschach ink blot. There are lots of different projective techniques, and we'll talk about them later in class. But the basic idea underlying all of the projective techniques is that we're going to assume that if you have an ambiguous material, like in this case an ink blot, it's unstructured, there's no inherent meaning to the ink blot. So, or the other materials that we'll talk about later, it's not always an ink blot. The unconscious will provide structure. The premise behind projective techniques is that in an ambiguous situation, the unconscious will feel safe to project itself onto the ambiguous item and pretend like the unconscious is actually not the source of the meaning. There is inherent meaning in this ambiguous figure. So, for example, if you look at this ink blot and you say that is obviously a skull, your unconscious is like, okay, I have some kind of content relating to skulls or death or whatever my content is, and I'm going to very confidently say, it's not me projecting that out. It's naturally, obviously a skull that is depicted in that ink blot. It is a skull. It's not me projecting. Another person might say it's two witches flying towards each other. Or somebody else might say it looks like three birds taking off at the same time, and they're sort of, their wings are intertwined or whatever. Like there are in fact different interpretations that could be made, but the unconscious pretends like there's not and feels comfortable projecting itself onto the object and saying the object is what I'm projecting onto it. So what would a skull be? Like, what's the meaningfulness of that? Well, that's where, projective tests are a little bit weak, because your interpretation of the ambiguous figure is going to be interpreted by, a skilled professional. I mean, like, it takes somebody else to interpret what your projection really means. And that's a pretty subjective way of measuring personality, right? Like, it's in the eye of the beholder what your projection means. Now, there are, like, for Rorschach ink blots, there's a whole scoring rubric of what these different interpretations mean. But the creation of that list was subjective. So while it looks like an objective way of scoring, it's based on subjective principles. And so it's got some problems. Self-report measures are measures where, you are either asked a series of questions like is depicted in the image, or you're asked questions and you could give any answer you want, like it's a fill in the blank or essay kind of question where, I ask you a question and you can explain to whatever degree you want to explain. Either way, these are called self-report measures. So we ask how you typically behave, and then we count on you being accurate. We assume that you remember how you normally behave. We assume that you're not motivated to mislead us about how you normally behave. We assume that you are not trying to mislead yourself about how you typically behave because you're embarrassed or don't want people to know or whatever. So that's a lot of assuming about accuracy, right? And so that's a big complaint about self-report measures, is that the person may not know or may not want you to know what the true answers are on that. Now, there are different ways to develop self-report measures. One is what's called the theoretical method. And so you use some theory to guide you in designing the questions. So there are certain personality scales that are based on Jungian theory, some that are based on Cattell's theory of intelligence. There are different self-report measures that use a theory to help them to decide what the questions are going to be. Others use the empirical method, where they generate a whole bunch of questions that pertain to different kinds of behaviors, and then they give it to people and see if there is any coherence to how they answer the questions. They use a statistical process called factor analysis to figure out which questions seem to go together, right? This is how Eysenck developed his self-report measures. He actually went out into the world, administered just a whole bunch of questions, and then went back and did factor analyses and discovered that people who answered, question 3 like this also answered questions 18, 47 and 55 in a similar way. And so those questions must go together and measure some trait. So it's an empirical method where you let the way people answer actually help you to decide what the traits must be. Then there's the rational method. And that would be where, you develop your questions based on some generally accepted definition of the trait. So there are a lot of scales that are developed like that. Like, you can read scientific articles where they describe the process that they followed in developing their personality scale. And they'll go into great detail about how this trait that they're going to measure has been defined by other people. This is what we think is included in this trait based on what other people have talked about. And this is sort of what we all have accepted as this trait. So these are the questions that I made up because this is what we all seem to think that it's comprised of. There's a new scale that, well, it's not that new anymore. It was created in like 2015. But it's a scale that assesses your commitment to the environment. I can't remember the full title of it, but it's asking environmental questions. And the questions were based on the rational method. Like, this is what we think, what we all seem to agree means to be, concerned about the climate. And so these are all different questions that I wrote that all relate to this general definition. So sometimes it's, the scale is developed that way. Sometimes it's theoretically based, like the Myers-Briggs is based on a theoretical method. And then the empirical method, the empirical method is probably the purest as far as scientifically, because it doesn't include the biases of the author, but it's kind of also the trickiest to develop, because you have to write a whole bunch of questions that may or may not relate to anything and see if they go together. And so it can be kind of the trickiest method to implement. The last major way of measuring personality would be to use a structured interview where there are these open-ended questions and the person can say anything they want. And, so let's say in the picture, so tell me about yourself. Like, that's about as open-ended as you can get. And the person can choose to tell you whatever they feel like telling you. So structured interviews, we maybe start off with, so tell me about yourself. And then maybe we follow up with a question that's pre-planned. Everybody hears the same question no matter what they said to that first thing. So tell me a little bit more about your childhood. Where were you born? And then they have that. And, we may start drilling down into more specific things. But the structured interview, the characteristic is that we have planned questions and the respondent can say whatever they want in response to these planned questions. The tricky part about the structured interview is now that you have all the things that the person said, you have to figure out what it means, in light of your theory or, the agreed upon definitions of whatever you're measuring. You have to figure out what did they actually say. And given that they could have said anything, they can use different kinds of words to describe the same exact thing. And so it can be really tricky to figure out what exactly you got from a structured interview. This is what we call qualitative research, where we try and figure out the meanings behind, the qualities that the person is describing. So it's probably one of the trickiest methods. All right. Let's go ahead and stop here. And in the next segment, we'll come back and we'll talk about how we can measure behavior.